Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Global History with Mr. Langella. So, guys, this is our last section. We're going to talk about the kingdoms of Southeast Asia and Korea. Okay, so last time we were here, guys, we talked about Japan. We talked about the samurai and the westernized knights. You guys completed the homework on those two. I really find Japanese history to be really interesting and really fun. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. So we're going to talk, like I said, we're going to finish off with the kingdoms of Southeast Asia. So just to give you guys the setting the stage here, south of China lies what we consider Southeast Asia. All right, and within this area, we kind of bunch in a lot of different areas. So we're going to talk mainly about Cambodia, and we're going to talk about Vietnam. We're going to talk about Korea as well. But there are a lot of other nations that are included in Southeast Asia. Now, what's interesting to tell you guys about this topic is the idea that basically all these different nations were influenced by China. All right, now China was the biggest influencer of all these nations because of how China had dominated each one of them for so many different years. Okay, and for a lot of the time, there were trade routes that were developed because of China's dominance. Now, over time, however, China starts to lose a lot of their influence because of what's going on around them. Whether it's going to be the Mongols that start to combat them, or if it's just other nations in general, or just a poor working of their governments. But because of this, China loses influence, and now trade routes are being used in other different ways. Even though all these nations are very small, they actually do become very prosperous, and they do have a lot of advancements that do help the world in the grand scheme of everything. Okay, that's what's interesting about this concept, is that even though whenever we think of Asia, we always think of major nations like China. We think of Japan, even though Japan's not that large, but they're bigger than a lot of other nations in Asia. But just because the nations may not be as massive as some of the other ones, doesn't mean that they do not have contributions or not as known as other nations are. Okay, so let's talk about just first off the geography of Southeast Asia. Okay, so this is the area between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. This includes mainlands and islands. There are 5 major rivers on the mainland, but mountains make travel between these different areas extremely difficult. Now, the key to really the power of this is to control the trade routes, and all the different harbors that you can use to continue with trade. As you can see on the map here, guys, there is a massive trade route along Southeast Asia. Now, we always associate the most powerful trade route as being the Silk Road, which is true. But understand that if you control the sea trade out in Asia, then you're going to make the most money. Because remember, China for most of the time was controlling the trade, right? They were the ones that had all these different nations under their control, right? And they were controlling the trade throughout all the different border routes here. But as China starts to weaken, we start to see new nations start to develop, and then they control their own different areas of trade. Okay, so when the 2 major groups that had to influence all the different nations here, as I already mentioned, was China, but also India as well. That's how Buddhism and Hinduism started to spread throughout a lot of these different nations, these smaller nations. And Indian influence does still ring true today in these different areas. So, like I said, it's a mixture of both Chinese and Indian. So one of the first kingdoms we're going to talk about started out of Cambodia. All right, so this is the Khmer Empire, or the Khmer Empire. They In 800, by 800, they had conquered the different kingdoms of their area and created their first empire. All right. Now, the most important things that you should talk about in the Khmer Empire is how they were able to improve cultivation and farming, especially with rice. Now, what's really important about this is because the techniques in which they use cultivating rice actually allows them to produce 3 to 4 times as many rice as anyone else could. Now, other nations around the area take on the same ideas, and they end up kind of using their methods as well. Right, so that's really important to understand. When you have more rice available to you, it means you can have more population. When you have more population, it means more power. Okay. Now, one of the most famous things that they were able to accomplish was create the Buddhist temple, oh sorry, Hindu temple, the Angkor Wat. All right, the Angkor Wat was a massive complex, and this is what it looks like here. Massive complex that is dedicated to the Hindu god Vishu, Vinshu. All right. Oh, sorry. What I want you guys to do before we move on, let me see, just go back for you, is answer this question here. What does the size and splendor of Angkor Wat suggest about the empire that constructed it? All right, so this one's kind of easy. So make sure you just try to answer the question underneath. So other different empires start to develop around the islands of the same area. Now, we're not going to go too deep into some of these islands, but there are a few of them mentioned here. Salandrea, the Salandrea kings had created different empires here, but we're not going to go too deep into it. That's why I just want to give you just an idea that basically around the same time period, all these other smaller nations were also creating different kingdoms. So instead of it being, let me try to just go back to give you guys a sense, without it just being China dominating everybody, there was basically a battle for all these different trade routes, right? We started to see the Khmer Empire, started to see some of these smaller empires start to develop. So instead of China basically having influence all over all these different areas, instead it started being really more of a divide, all right? And we saw this when we talked about China previously. Remember that they didn't have as much influence as they once did many years ago. They were excelling in what they were doing, but they did not have the same reach as they once did in previous empires. So that's really the point I wanted to get across, was that there are a bunch of different empires that start to be created, and in their own areas they start to dominate. So instead of it being really a China rules all type of mentality, it was really a division between all these different nations and the different empires, and now the trade was more competitive. Now, one of the most important ones I want to talk about for this section was the Dai Viet. All right, so during the Han Dynasty, China had controlled Southeast Asia, but when it transitioned to the Tang Dynasty, it actually weakened parts of the farther reaches of the empire itself. Remember, they did expand into certain areas, but it did not expand to areas where the Vietnam was. So Dai Viet were basically a Vietnamese origin, right? They ended up breaking away from China and creating their own kingdom in 939. All right. Now, obviously, with being connected to China for so many years, they're going to be influenced by China, right? So they're influenced mainly by their culture, by the use of Buddhism, and the way that they create their government, right? Their government structure. Now, they do keep their cultural identity in many aspects, but they do take ideas from them. Mainly, one of the most important things you can say about the Dai Viet was that their women had actually a lot more independence than China did. Now, after they've kind of survived for many years, generally around 70 years after their first breaking away, the Li Dynasty was kind of probably the more golden ages. One of the golden ages of Dai Viet, and they actually had changed the capital to Hanoi, right? And it was based around the Red River Delta. Now, during this time period, they had established a strong bureaucracy, strong central government, very much mirrored after China, and they actually improved the trade system or river navigation, and they even increased agriculture, right? Also during this time, so they allowed themselves to kind of prosper in many different ways, but mainly through developing trade routes, creating a strong bureaucracy, and increasing agricultural practices. Now, they were able to influence different areas around them, but this dynasty, the Li Dynasty, had basically become the biggest influencer of what Vietnam is today. All right, so now I want you guys to answer this question. How was Vietnam's culture influenced by Chinese culture? All right, so let's transition now into Korea, right? As I said, I wanted to talk about certain places. I felt that Vietnam, Korea. These were all major nations that we all know today. So let's talk about Korea. Now, Korea, as you know, even today has a major partnership with China. The reason why is because a lot of Korean origins are based after China. Okay, so their culture really is a shared culture of China in a lot of ways because Korea was always a part of China for many, many years. So let's dive into their geography. So firstly, Korea, if you did not know, is a peninsula. All right, so this is land surrounded by water. There's not a lot of farming land that they can use here because a lot of it is mainly mountains. Now, because of the way that their land is, where it's basically mountains and seas, they're an isolated nation. And this actually ends up making them into almost like a isolationist style, right? They kind of stay away from a lot of new outside ideas. Now, only if they are conquered do they get really forced upon a different culture, which means usually when you're an isolated nation, it means that you don't really try to expand your trade. You try not to increase new ideas. You're trying to stay the same because you're very you're very separated from everybody. Now, generally, look at the size of Korea. It's the same size as our current state of Utah. Now, what's interesting about Korea is that they actually have very extreme temperatures of hot in the summer and cold in the winter, right? People that may not know that about Korea, but it does get pretty extreme there. So, with that being said, they don't have the most land to farm on compared to others. Now, remember, their nation is not the largest. Remember, it's the size of Utah, right? And that's kind of crazy to think. But, yeah, just an entire country is the size of Utah. And they don't really have a lot of availability to expand either, all right? Because now, just look at their neighbors, right? They are separated from Manchuria. They are right next to China, and across the seas, Japan. There's not really a way that you could expand from there. Now, what happens is the origins of Korea was that there were different clans controlling the areas. They basically had set up almost like states or regions or kingdoms that they had separated each other with. And the Han dynasty in China had conquered Korea. Now, during this time, you really started to see a lot of the different influence from China being there, as in the governing methods, the religion, systems of writing. Now, during Han rule, this is where everything was kind of stable because they already knew that they were being dominated by another nation. Certain Korean tribes start to gather and they created their own kingdoms or federations within Chinese control, right? And they started to battle out with each other to gain control over over someone else's land more than somebody else. The Silla kingdom ends up defeating the others and drives China out of their rule, right? During this time, during the Silla rule, or if you want to call it the Silla dynasty, usually they don't really consider it a dynasty. During Silla rule, there was a influx of Buddhist practices, so more Buddhist monasteries, a spread of Buddhist beliefs. You start to see more, art building, poetry. You start seeing bronze sculptures being developed and a writing system being developed. Okay, so now let's transition into the next dynasty. So after a certain period of time, the Koryu dynasty starts to kind of emerge as its next successor. They can take control over Korea, and now they're ruling basically from 935 to 1392. Okay, now they model the government completely after China. All right, now because what happens is, if you look at the previous, that when the Silla, when they rule, okay. Now, when they rule over their group, they don't want to necessarily be a copy of China, okay? They basically want to, since they've been kind of dominated by China for so long, they don't want to be the same. Very similar to the other concepts I talked about when it was, the United States and Britain and other nations that were always, they're always rivals with one another. You don't want to be the same as somebody else. Now, with Korea being dominated for so long under the Han dynasty, they don't want to be the same as China. Do they take concepts from them? Yes, but they aren't exactly the same. Now, the Koryu dynasty, when they take control, right, and they rule, and they've ruled for a very long time. Okay, so if you look at 935 to 1392, that's a long time. The reason why they are taking a lot of ideas from China was because they saw how successful China was, and we saw this in a lot of different ways. Okay, we saw this even in Japan when Japan had formed their nation. They had taken ideas from China as well because they saw how successful with Prince Kyoku. He saw how impressive they were, right? So he wanted to take some things from them, but not be them completely. So one of the things they did take from China was the civil service exam. All right. Now the big difference was that it was not meant for for low nobility or low peasants, right? It only was for the rich. So they did not provide a sense of social mobility within their government structure. Now they were divided amongst the land aristocracy. So this is basically the rich and those that were running the military, right? They were the higher people of society, and then came the commoners and slaves. Okay, so if you were looking at a pyramid, right, the social pyramid, 1 would be the aristocracy, right? 2 would be military officials or government officials. 3 would be commoners, and then 4 would be slaves. Okay, so that's how you would look at their social pyramid. Now, despite having a civil service exam, there was never really a time where a rich individual's family was not put in a best position. So it basically was, it was a civil service exam, but it was a rigged one. Like it wasn't really, open to all commoners and rich individuals. It was basically saying, yeah, we have this exam, but the rich are going to get the government jobs anyway. So it really was not as fair or effective. Now, even though they do take ideas from China, and even though that they were isolated from a lot of their neighbors, they were still beaten by the Mongols. Right? Remember, this is happening during the same time as the Mongols are now about to spread their influence over everybody. So they were dominated by the Mongols from 1231 to 360. All right, and in 1392, the Scholar officials overthrow the Koryu dynasty. Okay, so this is kind of like the last thing we talk about with Korea before we move forward. So before we finish, I want you guys to answer this question here: how did the Koryu government compare with the early imperial government of Japan? So I want you guys to take the information here, and I want you to compare it to how Japan had created their government style. All right, and I also gave you guys a modern day look at what's going on in Korea today. This is kind of showing you what modern day Korea, the information here. Okay. Nope. So let me just make sure I finish this. I forgot there was one more section. Okay. Yeah, so this is just talking about the Koryu culture. All right, so that will be kind of the way we finish from here. So I want you guys now to answer these 4 questions. These are good quiz questions. These are good test questions. So make sure you answer them to the best of your ability. If you're confused, you should look back at the PowerPoint. Lastly, I want you guys to answer these 2 main ideas. Describe the 2 sources of prosperity for Southeast Asia empires, and number 2, what were the major accomplishments of the Koryu dynasty? I provide you guys a chart. Now, since this is the final section, I give you a chart of all the different areas we discussed in this chapter. And then last 2 questions that summarize everything. I want you guys to look at the primary source here and answer the questions, and look at the map and answer the questions. Okay? So your homework assignment for this day will be to make sure you answer all the PowerPoint questions and submit those notes to me. All right, guys. Have a good one.